So hi everyone, and welcome to the third and final session of our three-day conference, Mobilization, Interaction, Contention, Relations between NGOs, Civil Society, and States in Times of COVID-19. I'm Omri. I co-organize this conference with Katerina Konarek, Michal Ben-Gal, and Deborah Shmueli, and Elise Salzberger in the University of Haifa, with cooperation of three centers in the university: the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions, the National Knowledge and Research Center for Emergency Readiness, and the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. We already had 2 days of the conference, so this will be our last and our final panel. The first 2 days are on YouTube. I will share the links later in the chat. And today's panel is titled From Publics to Civil Society, Changes in Collective Cohesion During COVID-19. Please note that after the panel will conclude, around 7:30, and everyone's invited to stay for the conference's closing comments by Professor Elise Salzberger, who's head of the Minerva Center. I'll now quickly introduce the participants in our panel, who are three presenters and one discussant. Before I'll introduce everyone again more extensively before you speak. So for now, just please say hi when I say your name. And this will be the order of participation also. So first, hi to Hannah Mayne. Hi. Hi to Ela Drazkiewicz.
Hello.
And hi to Guy Shalev. And hello to our discussant, Amalia Saar. So thank you all for being here, and to our few people in the audience as well. We move on to Ela Drazkiewicz. Ela has a PhD from Cambridge University, and she is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Sociology at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. Ela has a number of excellent publications, including her book, which was published last year through Bergen, Institutionalized Dreams, The Art of Managing Foreign Aid. Ela's current focus is the intersection of science, the state, and health economies, particularly vaccinations and how different institutional and individual agents negotiate their own, often conflicting agendas. The title of Ela's talk today is Political Critique, Political Trust, Conspiracy Theories in Civil Organizations, Understanding State, Non-State Relations at the Time of COVID-19 Pandemic. Ela, please, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. I will share slides with you that are giving a little bit of illustration. As I will be speaking, I would like to ask for your patience and understanding, because the topic, I've been working on conspiracy theories for a while now, but this specific paper is an exploration of some very new ideas for me. So I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback, because maybe I'm having it all completely wrong. So I just wanted to hear your voices as well. But the topic in general, talking about conspiracy theories, is a tricky issue, because conspiracy theories became recently the social enemy. And often researchers who try to have empathetic eye towards them, towards people who express conspiratorial views, are accused of giving air to the enemy, of siding with the enemy. So it's a tricky field. But I do think it's important to do research in that area and to see how conspiracy theories motivate practice and political action. So this is what I would like to talk about today, especially the intersection between state, civil society, and conspiracy theory, and people who propagate them, in order to explore where do conspiracy theories fit in this state non-state relationships. So generally, I would like to start by going back a little bit up to the 80s or 90s, when political researchers were concerned that the biggest problem of future will be political apathy. And the biggest concern was what can be done about it. And one of the ways of addressing that issue was rediscovery of the civil society. And at that time, social and political so in the global North and East and South, political scientists prescribed wide-scale citizen participation as central to strengthening both established and emerging democracies. Participation was linked to the production of democratic citizens. As Jessica Grinberg wrote, in keeping with US and Western European policy goals for economic liberalization, these new participatory approaches also integrated liberal notions of individual agency and choice. And the key solution to political apathy was the reinvention, as I said, of the civil society embodied in the formalized associations, NGOs, nonprofit, the so-called third sector. But 30 years from then, we are now moving into the new era when the biggest fear is not the apathy, but rage. This rage is increasingly blamed on conspiracy theories and movements propagating them. As a result, conspiracy theories became identified as the problem of the current times. In this view, conspiracy theories are linked to and blamed for populist movements of the Trump or Brexit era, or the rule of Putin, Kaczynski, Orban, and others. Already before the pandemic, conspiracy theories were identified by the World Health Organization as the biggest threat to public health. And the arrival of the COVID-19 ultimately sealed the status of conspiracy theories as the key social enemy of the current times. So today I would like to take the opportunity to consider how did we get here? How did we move from the apathy to rage? And where do conspiracy theories fit in this non-state state nexus? The goal of this paper is to consider the triangle connecting and disconnecting state, civil society, and movements propagating conspiracy theories. And most of my paper will be based on the research I have been conducting in Ireland since 2018, where I have mostly worked on the conflicts over HPV vaccine. And but today I will not be focusing specifically on groups which are directly and only focused on the HPV, but they cite supporters, mostly Gemma O'Doherty and John Waters, who are leaders of the Anti-Corruption Ireland movement. And already before the pandemic, they were quite known to the public as the far-right activists who held strong anti-immigration views. And in the pandemic, however, their agenda moved from far-right and anti-migrant to anti-lockdown. And they were among the very first European citizens who sued their own government for the lockdown measures. So they took Irish authorities to court, and they lost in the court. And the action was labeled as motivated by conspiracy theories. And of course, both activists and their supporters strongly reject that label, knowing that it's highly damaging and pathologizing. Instead, they like to identify themselves as activists, as citizens representing the people. They are acting on behalf of the citizens. They are protecting their interests against corrupt ruling elite. They see their movement as a way to overcome social apathy. Their goal is to wake up gullible Irish society and to take political action. Their call for action is justified through the urgency caused by the state measures against the pandemic. They describe lockdown rules as oppressive, authoritarian, and unnecessarily draconian. They are perceiving Irish state as authoritarian regime, and they often compare it to communist or Nazi regime. The ACA embraces liberty, individualism, and strong limitation of the state sphere. It seeks to influence and claim back the space taken by the state. All those notions, in particular, the opposition to the state and in the emphasis on the individual freedom, also happen to be pillars of the civil society ideology. Originally, civil society and the social participation were envisioned as remedy to authoritarian rule. This is exactly the kind of agenda that ACA embraces and does so successfully. While the early 2020 anti-lockdown demonstrations are here on the left attracted, as you can see, very small group of supporters, only a few months later, O'Doherty and her supporters were able to gather thousands of people on the streets to protest the lockdowns. So the activities I'm sorry, of the ACA appear to be perfect explosion of civil society, of the participation. They are strongly opposing the hegemonic state. They promote social mobilization. The approximation of the ICA movement to civil society is further achieved through specific modus operandi that O'Doherty and her supporters apply. Firstly, to counter the narrative that describes them as isolated individuals, they present themselves as the leaders of the civil movement. Like other social movements, also this one has a website that you can see here. It does not differ much from other typical websites run by NGOs. It includes a mission statement, short videos of leaders. There is a section describing activities. There is a space to download helpful documents. It includes contact details. You can make donations, and there is a special section to learn how to get involved and get active. So you can see how O'Doherty and Walters are following the repertoire typical for civil society. They organize informal campaigns. They are distributing leaflets. They are canvassing. They are organizing meetings. They run social media accounts, organize legal demonstrations, and they are taking all available legal paths, such as going to court and sue their own government. They are, so they even, O'Doherty also even ran for the elected, for the positions in the EU Parliament, and she ran in some Irish local elections. So framed in this way, the works of Anti-Corruption Ireland and its leaders appear as perfectly fitting the description of the civil society. Like civil society, ICI emphasizes participation, it embraces democratic methods of action and community-based approach. ACA is not legally registered. Nevertheless, through applying technologies of communication typical for NGOs, it wants to be seen as a formalized movement, an association of like-minded people. It has clearly identifiable leaders and applies the lingo, which was also current, which was also typical for the main Irish issues of the last few years. So when they are using the lingo, it's the lingo that has been applied in the water charges protests, in the marriage equality referendum, and abortion referendum. So they are using the same terms, the same vocabulary, such as body autonomy, freedom, state corruption. So they clearly want to be part of the conversations that civil society is holding. They are appropriating the same lingo. So overall, in its form, philosophy, discourse, ICI comes across as part of Irish civil society. So why does it seem so wrong to say that Gemma O'Doherty and her Anti-Corruption Ireland are the champions of civil society? If it ticks all boxes, why does it seem so wrong? So I would like to explore a few options here, what to do about it. So the cringe that follows the suggestion that perhaps we should categorize movements that embrace conspiratorial views as the members of civil society is not a comfortable one. And it's not comfortable even for me, who is suggesting that outrageous idea. But perhaps it is not my suggestion that is wrong, but maybe there is something wrong with the way we conceptualize civil society. As Ferguson pointed out, one of the problems with the civil society concept, which is predominantly based on the state-non-state dichotomy, is that it assumes that all political forms that challenge the hegemony of the state are necessarily well conceived as local, grassroots, or civil and supporting democracy. Questioning the usefulness of the civil society ideology in African and Eastern European context, also other anthropologists criticized it for embracing illiberal individualism and allowing state to roll back. The assumption behind anthropological critique was that the civil society ideology is simply a Western-centric concept, and it does not match cultures and/or social organizations of non-Western societies. What remained unchallenged was the assumption that civil society does fit and belong to does belong to the Western states. However, here we are today, facing movements such as ACA, which embrace every aspect of civil society ideology to the extent that maybe no one has ever done before. They are glorifying liberal individualism. They call for the rollback of the state. They emphasize the opposition between state and the people. So why does it not feel right? Civil society was supposed to be a remedy to the problems with democracy, but the easiness with which radical movements such as ACI fit into the civil society sphere suggests that perhaps civil society ideology was not part of the solution to the troubled relationship between the state and the social sphere, but part of the problem. Perhaps the individualism, the rollback of the state are also not so great for the West, not just for Africa and Eastern Europe. There is an option too. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe organizations such as ICI are not part of the civil society, but they are just some sort of caricature, deviation, pathology, a civil society gone wrong. It is a form and in its form and key ideological features, ICI fits with the broadest definition of civil society. What makes it different from other organizations is its morality. Civil society is not just a concept concerned with political participation. It is a moral issue. Although it began as a critical perspective challenging authoritarian forms of governance, participatory culture has become a means of transforming societies into moral polities oriented towards a common good. But at the time of the pandemic, a common good became seized by the state. In the name of protecting the public and common good, most states, such as Ireland, opted to limit certain social liberties. By orienting itself against the state, ACA suddenly became oriented also against the public good. It lost its moral compass. In this context, the problem with ICA and the people such as Authority is not necessarily that they endorse conspiratorial views, many of us are, but that they do use conspiratorial critique against the public good. But defining civil society as a moral project also carries some problems. Whose morals civil society is supposed to embrace? How do we decide who is in and who is out? To argue that endorsement of conspiracy theories should be the key reason to exclude someone from the civil society is not accurate. I recently conducted some research with Elisa Sobo, again comparing Ireland, Poland, and the United States, and the evidence from Poland showed clearly that if people express conspiratorial views in support of democracy, those views are not labeled as conspiratorial views. They are not pathologized. So further, conspiracy theories are used by people on all sides of the political spectrum, both left and right. To use conspiratorial views as the marker of inclusion or exclusion from civil society would be a highly arbitrary endeavor. The arbitrary nature of the ways in which the notion of civil society is applied has already been criticized by scholars working in the global East and South. As many of them noted, conceptualization of civil society in moral terms allows for it to become a tool for inclusion-exclusion. It becomes a bourgeois project. And perceived in such way, civil society is in certain ways excluding certain groups or endorsing from itself, from civil society. Civil society associated with high morals, civil individuals, has little patience for conspirationists perceived at the best as uneducated, gullible idiots, and at the worst as uncivil, malicious people driven by rage. And there is option 3 that I thought about that maybe again I got it all wrong. Maybe conspiracy theories are not part of civil society, but they're just pretending to be one. That's the slide, sorry. To date, most research suggests that organizations and individuals who express conspiratorial beliefs mimic state bureaucracy. Using examples of chemtrails and environmental theories popular in California, Vine and Curry argue that villain forces uncovered by conspiracy theories borrow their key characteristics from the bureaucratic form. Like bureaucracy, the enemy described in conspiracy theories is depersonalized, faceless, and oppressive. It is rational and constantly expands its authority. Both conspiratorial enemies and bureaucracy are seen as highly powerful. Similar observations are made by Mahmoud, who studied Masonic conspiracy movements in Italy. She shows that strategies of transparency of those who are accused of conspiratorial thinking follow the rules of the state bureaucratic logic. But the close observation of ACA suggests that mimetic nature of conspiracy theories goes beyond state bureaucracy, and in their practice, ACA strongly borrows from civil society. Vine and Curry argued that conspiracy theories borrow their shape from bureaucracy because state bureaucracy is the key enemy. This might suggest that if ACA borrows its shape from civil society, its main enemy is increasingly civil society and not the state.
Ela, sorry, can you conclude? Sorry, Ela. Can you
Yeah, I'm literally concluding now.
Sorry.
So this is, this slide and one more. So the most common approach to conspiracy theories defines them as allegations that particular actors have conspired to do something covertly, dysfunctional or evil. It is accompanied by a feeling of persecution, not against oneself, but against one group, race, nation, gender, class, etc. It is also a feeling of persecution against the way of life, values, and culture. Indeed, many conspiracy narratives are not only fixated on revealing the enemy, but also they claim that they are defending traditional way of life and culture. And indeed, in Ireland, the drivers of the change, the Ireland that is changing, that has been changing in the last decade, was civil society and definitely not the state. And Ireland went to very important referendums in the last decade, the marriage equality, the abortion referendum. These movements, those changes were provoked by the civil society. So it is not surprising that ACA, which expresses this concern about losing the traditional Ireland, is identifying civil society as its main enemy. So for the last decade, we were fixated on the questions, what does the rise of conspiracy theory mean for democracy? But perhaps we should be more concerned about its consequences for civil society. And the mimicking of civil society allows groups which are propagating conspiratorial views to gain credibility. They appear as legitimate. It strengthens the capacities. It's giving them opportunity to get funding, to being a part at the table in the official debates. But it's also muddying the waters of civil society. It's becoming more difficult to understand who is legitimate actor and who is not. And it is questioning the whole concept, the membership in that cohort is questioning the whole idea of civil society. So what can be done? One, we can expect state to take some action, but for state to take some action in that sphere is very difficult because it would risk accusations of interfering with the freedom of association, speech, and all those civil liberties. So instead, state chooses to pour a lot of funding to NGOs and researchers that they will solve the problem. However, this might create certain frictions where NGOs are responsible and civil actors for deciding who is worthy of the membership, who is not, and might lead to culture wars. Doing nothing is another option, but there's also an option which is taken already by some states, which do recognize that those movements are just members of the civil society and they do deserve funding. And because those states, such as Poland or Hungary, they see civil society as the main enemy, they are willing and they are interested in supporting those specific groups, giving them strength while just cutting some funding opportunities for other organizations to grow. So I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ela. That was really interesting and super relevant for our conference. I think it also shed some interesting retrospective light at some of the themes that we discussed in the previous sessions. So now we move on to our third and last speaker before we move on to Amalia Saar, a discussant. So the next speaker is Guy Shalev. Guy is a medical and political anthropologist whose research concerns the intersections of medical professionalism ethno-national politics and bioethics in Israel-Palestine. Guy has a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Guy is also super modest because his biography doesn't mention his many, many awards and accolades. So I can just note that he has many. So Guy is our last speaker before Amalia. And again, I'm mentioning that if anyone has any questions or comments, you can post them in the Zoom chat and we'll refer to them if possible later. Guy, thank you.
Yes, hi, thank you, Omri, and thank you for the organizers of this very interesting panel. Today I'll be talking about a research I started working on in April 2020, a few weeks after the pandemic took control over our lives. It is a continuation of my PhD study that included fieldwork in 2 major Israeli hospitals and over 80 interviews with Palestinian doctors, medical students, and administrators. In fact, this is a zoom in on a very unique moment in the relationship between medicine and national politics, and the positionality of Palestinian physicians, both in Palestinian society and in Israel. For the purpose of this research, I recently completed interviews with 31 doctors, political activists, and public figures. And this talk today will focus more on the broader social context of these interviews. The immediate image that came to rule the public discourse about COVID in Israel-Palestine was, as in other places also, was the idea of we are all in the same boat. You can see here international coverage. The New York Times was particularly fond of this expression. And you can see also a slide here from a lesson plan for teachers to use via Zoom, on which I will talk a little bit later. But these are like few of many examples of the manifestations of this idea in public debates. In my research, I wanted to talk to political entrepreneurs who wanted to hop on this boat, harness this suddenly popular idea in an otherwise polarized society to achieve political objectives. One of these political activists was Shir, who said to me, the Jewish public looks at their Arab neighbors and it's not sure whether they're in the us or the them in most of Israel's wars. And now when the war is against the coronavirus, then the Arabs are suddenly totally in the us. And so the context in which this idea of everyone in this one boat again became eminent, the context is very specific. When the pandemic hit Israel, it was during its 3rd general election in the span of 1 year. The health crisis thus was intertwined with an unprecedented political crisis. This on the background of years-long neglect and erosion of the country's public health system, and on the background of decades-long exclusion and oppression of the indigenous Palestinian minority in Israel, especially its exclusion from political power and representation. In this moment then, Palestinian citizens of Israel found themselves in the center of these 2 concurrent crises. It became impossible to form a ruling coalition in the parliament without the Palestinian joint list. So they had an unprecedented political power on one side. And also after 2 decades in which Jewish Israeli turned to the more profitable career path of the high-tech industry, young Palestinians filled the ranks of the medical professions. So their share of the workforce reached some 20% of the healthcare workforce, which is similar to the proportion in the general population. This focus then on Palestinian physicians raised a few questions that guided my research. I wanted to ask what happens when medical professionals are drawn into national politics, which political horizons are opened up, and what are their limitations? How do different actors make sense of the political and the professional in this specific context? And what are the implications for Palestinian medical professionals, for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and for the Israeli public medical system at large? Public discourse around this sudden focus on Palestinian citizens was very polarized. Right-wing and centrist politicians led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu poured millions into media campaigns against the legitimacy of Palestinians' participation in the country's political system, as seen here in the picture on the left. At the same time, others from all over the political spectrum bent over backwards to congratulate Palestinian medical practitioners' efforts on the pandemic front lines. The picture on the right, by the way, showing a mixed ambulance team during a prayer break became viral And Netanyahu, who was the leader of the other side of the slide with the incitement campaigns, addressed this picture of the ambulance in his Independence Day speech with great pathos, while he was, when he was really busy in the height of a poisonous incitement campaign against Palestinian citizens. At the same time, as I show here, a few political entrepreneurs saw this double focus as an opportunity to disrupt the exclusion of Palestinians and advance coexistence. For example, a petition that you could see in the previous slide here of medical personnel called that the voice of an Arab citizen at the ballot box should be equal to the voice of an Arab doctor in the operating room, trying to connect these polarized discussions. But as common in Israel, the language of this public discourse was militaristic. The use of militaristic jargon, symbolism, ritualism, and metaphors became all too prevalent in the Israeli reaction to the health crisis. The Israeli Air Force staged a flyover across Israel's hospitals, saluting the medical teams. Teachers were pressed to forego vacation days and get under the stretcher, a common military metaphor for sharing the load. Independence Day billboards announced, "We will defeat the coronavirus too," resonating Israel's war history. Memorial Day services addressed casualties in the war against our new enemy. Among these, worth noting is the outrageous remark by the COVID Saar, Professor Ronnie Gamzu, who addressed the higher contagion rates among Palestinians as a mass terror attack. But in Israel, pandemic time militarism was not only discursive, the security system took center stage in decision-making processes, supervision and execution in fighting the pandemic, including the Israeli Defense Forces, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, military industries, and critics pointed out how security officials and specialists pushed aside public health experts, made unprofessional decisions, and infringed upon civil rights. In war, the physicians who were posted at the front lines and risked their lives to save others became heroes. But since a fifth of Israel's healthcare workers are Palestinian citizens, Israeli heroism took on a new face. As Shir, a Jewish Israeli political activist, told me, the admission test to Israeliness is mostly the military and the service in the wars. And that's something Arab citizens have never been part of. I think this is the first time that Arabs are at the front lines of an Israeli war of survival, and they're national heroes. In this period, Shir initiated, together with a group of activists, the viral campaign Partners in Faith, Partners in Governance. You can see it on the right here. At the same time, with no coordination, a few other public campaigns were launched. Two other successful campaigns presented here where Asaf Kaplan's Thank the Heroes of Medicine, this is the one in the center, and Accord Center's partnership in the fight against the coronavirus. It's a Zoom lesson plan that was distributed among high school teachers across the country. That's on the left. They all presented Palestinian healthcare workers as heroes fighting for the lives of Israelis in the aim of challenging the exclusion of Palestinian citizens in Israel. I interviewed 7 activists from 5 different campaigns while they were at their peak. Asaf, the one from the campaign in the middle, was very straightforward about his motivation to use doctors for the public political effect. It may sound bad, but the doctors were just a tool. I didn't care if they're doctors, teachers, or firefighters, but this was a very, very good opportunity. And the goal was, to some extent, to make those people who hate Arabs say, wait a minute, there are also good Arabs. 2 main themes were central to all these campaigns. One is that they underscored Palestinian doctors' role in saving Israeli lives. See, for example, how Asaf's campaign featured a Palestinian physician stressing her heroine life-saving role. He said, she's a hero. She saved the life of an Israeli patient. I mean, people here hate her in everyday life, and she's ill-treated, but she saved an Israeli patient. And my aim was that you'd see and understand and realize that they're not supporting the fighting, they're not Jew haters, and that they're here for us all. A second central theme, you can see on the right here, in these campaigns, show how the war on COVID presents to us an opportunity to see how the health sphere is a space of cooperation and coexistence, and that we should take its example. As Galit from Accord Center explained their strategy, we wanted visuals that show partnership very clearly. And not only talk about the Arab side or how the Jewish side accepts the Arab side, but something that speaks about an experience of communality and about very good interpersonal connections between the groups. Nevertheless, these campaigns and the responses they spurred were marked with tensions over the confluence of the political and the medical. In my PhD study, I showed how in Israel, the ethos of a politically neutral health sphere is a founding myth. It is strongly propagated by health administrators, professionals, politicians, and the media. In fact, it is often argued that the key to the country's diverse public health system is that politics is a taboo subject of conversation. Asaf was very clear about the limitations of a campaign that takes the hospital as its point of departure. The moment you take these guys, the doctors, and say something political about them, then you do. He then explained his strategy in the campaign. The idea was to let go of the rope slowly. I mean, I started with the softest stories. The doctor will save the person's life. This was the safest. And, I used content about partnership and togetherness without, there were a few texts in which I actually edited out sentences that people said about the ill treatment they received and such. And as I noticed that the reactions were supportive, I just slowly, step by step, turned to show kids speak Arabic and more. So he didn't even want to show Arabic in the campaign, fearing that it might seem too political. So only kids speaking Arabic, and only after he felt safe that he's got good responses for previous featuring of life-saving doctors. Leah and Galit from a court center described this challenge in their work with high school teachers. They acknowledge the narrowing freedom of speech in the Israeli education system, which is becoming more conservative by the year. They feared the backlash for administrators and students and wanted to help teachers to carefully find room for the message of partnership. They were thus very cautious in framing the lesson plan on mixed medical teams as moderately as possible. It's like opening a shaken up bottle of Coke, Leah said. We slowly unscrew the lid and allow emotional breaks for students to express themselves and to allow the teacher to map the class better. These tensions mark the limitations of the campaign. Within the confines of a neutral space, the political campaigns had so much to achieve. In spite of the potential harnessing of the increased visibility of Palestinian healthcare workers during a health crisis, the glass ceiling of political neutrality limited these campaigns' ability to profoundly change the political orthodoxy. For one, this tremendous weight on medical professionals who care for Jewish Israeli has set a very high bar for Palestinians to get basic legitimacy. As Majid, a Palestinian physician, told me, in the day that I'll be comfortable with being respected and getting legitimacy, even though I'm Arab, for being a doctor, I betray my people. Most of my interlocutors stress the fundamental problem with the idealization of the hospital as a space of care and partnership. Most Jewish Israelis can accept Arabs as doctors and caregivers, but they will not acknowledge their political legitimacy as Palestinians. As Hassan sharply said, these people that you call terrorists, the leaders of the Palestinian Joint List, are the people we elected as our representative. So you better think twice before you diss them. Beware, tomorrow you will come to the hospital and know that I voted for terrorists. The intensive debate around Palestinian healthcare workers underscores the limits of political recognition for the Palestinian indigenous national minority in Israel. Palestinian doctors were constantly asked to distance themselves from the Joint List as they demanded recognition. This was the case too with Shir's campaign, Partners in Faith, Partners in Government, that you can see here. They went farther than others and employed the hospital ideal to call for our participation in governance. But this does not go very far as well. It expects the members of the Palestinian national minority to forego their national subjectivity and join an exclusionary Zionist regime without calling for fundamental structural changes needed for advancing equality. In the settler colonial context in Israel-Palestine, the use of Palestinian doctors' heroism to call for their inclusion in the Zionist political game comes in the price of national erasure. For Majid, these campaigns demanded his submission as a Palestinian. This for him was directly connected to his grandfather's expulsion from his home village in the 1948 Nakba. That trauma never left. That trauma is transferred from generation to generation. My father wants me to keep running away. He wants me to run away too. You understand? And there's just no end to it, no end. And this is the same for me. I cannot run away all the time. I cannot beg all the time. I cannot keep proving myself. I will not use my medical profession to prove myself. That's it. If I haven't proven myself, not just me, my people, those who build this country and asphalt the roads, if they didn't prove themselves, I don't want to prove myself. And I don't want to run away. In moments of a global health crisis, the enhanced visibility of Palestinian healthcare workers in Jewish Israeli publics reflects a complex, multifaceted assemblage of a politics of recognition. My research looks into the different aspects of recognition and their interaction in this context. One aspect is the tension between recognition as respect for every human being's equal moral worth and recognition as esteem awarded based on contribution or merit. As Majid expressed clearly, the recognition of his achievement and contribution as a doctor not necessarily leads to recognition as a person and a citizen. In fact, it might even undermine it. Secondly, I examine recognition in relation to economies of reward and the meaning of symbolic rewards against the background of a precarious civil status. In what ways does the public recognition of Palestinian heroism on media translates into systemic change, promoting equal rights and budgetary and policy reforms? Finally, I look at the relationship between recognition of the individual and collective recognition of their community. How does the recognition of individual heroes, physicians, affect the political recognition and civil rights of their excluded community? In interviews with Palestinian physicians, political activists, and public figures, I ask about their experiences, perspectives, hopes, and expectations concerning this array of tensions, and I study the potential and limitations of the medical field as an arena for a politics of recognition. My initial findings show that the political imagination of Jewish Israeli political activists does not match the experiences and hopes of the doctors they present at the forefront of their campaigns. Increased visibility and heroism may publicly undermine demonization and marginalization, but ideological frameworks and professional ethics put a glass ceiling to a collective national recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. That was great. And another perspective that is really helpful to think about civil society through. So that was our last paper presentation, and we'll now move on to our discussant, who is Amalia Saar, Associate Professor in the Anthropology Department at the University of Haifa and a feminist peace activist. Amalia published several influential articles based on her research on Palestinian citizens of Israel, gender, neoliberalism, and feminist movements, including a book, which is a really good book, titled Economic Citizenship, Neoliberal Paradoxes of Empowerment, which was published by Bergen in 2016. She also recently published a new book in Hebrew with Hawazin Yunus, titled Diversity, Palestinian Career Women in Israel. Thank you so much, Amalia, for taking the time and the effort to respond to these three papers, and especially since the Department of Anthropology had a pretty intense conference also this week, so which ended yesterday. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Omri, for inviting me. These were fascinating papers, and I'm really glad I'm part of this. Nearly a year and nearly a year and a half into the global pandemic, and as the effects of what we may call social long COVID are starting to emerge, the present moment seems to magnify some of the characteristics of the late modern condition. Self-doubt and incessant and barren reflexivity pave the way to an explosion of affectivity as everything, from the market to security to health and wellness and so on, appears to articulate in emotional terms. The self itself has become a project that needs ongoing maintenance, and neoliberalism and securitization, which merely 2 decades ago appeared as two opposite possibilities of a past and a future, spill into one another and become a stalled present. In many of the rich countries, especially those that see themselves as democracies, an urgent mixture of vulnerability and risk has engendered what my former student, Dr. Rolly Rosen, has called caring surveillance, whereby individuals and communities self-submit to digital and corporeal forms of scrutiny, at once mesmerized and alarmed by its addictive effects, surrendering reluctantly yet pleasurably. In this cumbersome moral mood, and you mentioned the conference yesterday, so we spent a whole panel discussing Jason Throop's concept of moral mood. So in this cumbersome moral mood, the terms publics, civil society, and collective cohesion, which appear in the title of this panel, invoke, at least for me, some of the basic tensions underlying the idea of democracy, namely that between individual freedoms and collective belongings, and between grounded, messy social lives and the yearning for order, authority, or in another word, state. In the papers that we had, these tensions can be discerned, among other things, in the silences, or the gray matter that doesn't fit into what Wittgenstein has called standing language. That is the stuff that can be put into words and acknowledged within the limits of agreement. So in Guy's paper, liberal Jewish Israelis eager to reduce racism and enhance Israeli democracy are propagating the heroism of Palestinian medical staff during COVID out of sincere wish to applaud their work, acknowledge their contribution, and perhaps compensate them for the hate and racism that they sustain. However, the political imagination of these activists, Guy writes, doesn't match the experiences and hopes of the Palestinian doctors they present at the forefront of their campaigns. Something remains unarticulated, not as it were because the Palestinian doctors have no words for their position, they were quite explicit about it with Guy, but because the limited and fragile notion of democracy in Jewish-dominated Israel cannot contain their national hopes, entitlements, and sense of justice. This is hardly new or specific to COVID. In 2021, if you allow me a share of my own analysis, as a scholar writing about Palestinian citizens of Israel, as the occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of the Gaza Strip are increasingly pushed beyond the boundaries of legitimate public debate, and the label left is vaguely but powerfully identified as a shameful mark of the old Ashkenazi elite who are framed as self-hating Jews, democratic Jewish activists are all too aware that they must walk a delicate line of embracing the Palestinian citizens without being political, as if their national identity can remain a private issue. And perhaps it is not only a tactical choice, and it may be that the Palestinian national identification is also beyond the political sensitivities of some of the activists themselves. During COVID, as I said before, these deeply rooted local sensitivities regarding explosive political issues are merely aggravated. In Hannah's paper, these are the gender and the religious secular tensions that remain silenced, or rather not fully articulated. Not that gender and religiosity themselves are denied, quite to the contrary, they are very obvious in the ethnography. But their potential explosiveness appears interestingly subdued. As the men form a minyan across balconies, yards, and closed doors, the jogger may avoid, but she may also cross their path in her short sweat suit. Or she may avoid because she feels endangered, or because she feels it's rude and so she takes a bypass road. True, Hannah reported some complaints and concerns, but as I too witnessed during the lockdown, these were very mild if they were heard, and many actually became touched by the creativity of such praying practices. Whether this is a case in which space is appropriated or whether it is merely creatively rearranged, Whether there is exclusion there or actually greater inclusion, allowing religiosity and secularism to beautifully blend, is open to interpretation. One way or another, the powerfully liminal character of these makeshift prayer spaces and the pandemic's cumbersome moral mood shed a particularly strong light on the very tipping point between freedoms and belongings, messiness and authoritarian order that normally accompany the politics of gender and religiosity in the Israeli public space. It is also interesting to note that Hannah's and Guy's descriptions invoke very vividly the shifting of the public-private boundaries, which of course we are all well aware of by now, have all along been heuristic terms more than they have been empirical. But still, so the scenes of men in the balconies or even indoors who are part of the minyan while the women standing right there are not, are wonderful examples of how these boundaries are shifting and how space is always imaginary. In a sense, I forgot to mention also in Guy, I meant, is the hospital private or public? We can play with that as well. But back to Hannah's case study, in a sense, these scenes are on a continuum with the Jewish Eruv line that stretching between poles in the streets, marking the limits of movement while carrying stuff during the Shabbat, marking a Shabbat-specific boundary between private and public, which to some is akin to an impassable brick wall, while to others it is totally invisible. With a history of political debates and struggles over urban spaces, Eruv lines have symbolized long before COVID the fragility of democratic public spaces. Now in Ela's paper, the silence, the stuff that cannot be put into words and acknowledged within the limits of agreement, lies in that the group endorsing conspiratorial views appears like a perfect embodiment of civil society. The words are jarring, they tell lies, which Ela at least can tell that they do, but the practices mimic democratic practices, claiming to embody individual freedoms and resistance to the state. And so, like the Trojan horse, they sabotage democracy from within. Here, as it were, the silencing element is in that the words were robbed and put to bad use. And so Ela calls to change the language. She starts questioning the very concept of civil society itself. All three cases are much richer than the points I selected to highlight here, including some interesting intersections. I'll only notice one that comes to mind is the contingency between the shifting boundaries between private and public, which appear in Guy and Ela and Hannah's papers, and those between truth and false in Ela's work. So the question, who can we believe, is entwined with who do we trust, and this in turn is connected to a sense of group and social intimacy. Now, I got Ela's paper very late, so I didn't have time to incorporate it in as I would have liked to. I found it fascinating. However, I'm not sure that, Ela, your focus on the concept of civil society is fully worked out. You seem to work with the generic liberal ideal of civil society, which at least in anthropology has come under significant criticism for the past 20-odd years. Anthropologists now use this notion in a much more diverse sense, exploring it in a variety of cultural and political, Western and non-Western contexts. In fact, it is not necessarily used as a synonym to democracy. So I urge you to refine your use of terminology, not to forgo, but just to fine-tune it. Also, for example, your implied criterion that civil society is measured by the question, is this movement registered, legally registered? So invoking NGOs, NGOization is a neoliberal outgrowth of social movements, and it is greatly debated whether this is strengthening strengthening civil society and democracy, or the other way around. This is all to say that I think there's a great potential there. Anyway, to conclude, thank you for illuminating papers. I've managed only very scattered and preliminary thoughts, and I invite you, if there is time, to think together now how they may illuminate those aspects of democratic discourse and in our own academic and those aspects in our own academic discourse about democracy, civil spaces and civil actions, which evade articulation, and on how the pandemic's moral mood affects our interpretations of what takes place in each case study, considering that conflicting possibilities for interpretation are there from the outset. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalia. That was really engaging and I think very fruitful for everyone to think with. Does any of the presenters want to respond to Amalia's comments? Guy, go ahead.
Yeah, I can respond to Amalia and also to two other questions in the chat that was addressed to me. So maybe I'll start with first with Shmuel, who was first, about maybe there's a potential for a different kind of collaborations and relations because of the COVID crisis. So I said that I'm a very optimistic person. So I really try to see how this shifts in kind of public ideas of us and them, like Shir expressed in my research, how they can really still bring change, even though there are limitations. But I got to say that the recent events in May were a very kind of pessimistic response to this, to all of these kind of hopes, I think, and all of those people in the medical system that I used to talk to and I still talk to, and they always praise this coexistence of the healthcare. I think they were pretty left with not much words to describe what happened in May. And that I think is also related to what Amalia said about the silences. So at least in the medical sphere, it's the silencing, the action of like making these unsaid issues stay unsaid are very powerful. And for example, in Haifa, where Amalia is based, and when there was a plan to stage a demonstration in Rambam Hospital, all the workers of the hospitals got a very aggressive email from the director, making it clear that they would not be able to demonstrate, they would not be able to strike together with the co-nationals. So the silencing was very explicit and very aggressive. And I think, answering to Shmuel, I think it shows that if there is no real acceptance and discussion that addresses the core issues and the full subjectivities of the people you work with every day in the department, then the minute you got this kind of a heated, violent cycle like in May, you see that all this nonsense about coexistence just doesn't hold water. And just quickly answering to Katerina about the brain drain. So first, this was very explicitly the goal of the Israeli government in pushing young Palestinians to study medicine and study the sciences. There are a few evidence in protocols that the state should encourage Palestinians to go and study the STEM, because then they will be too busy to deal with to bother themselves with politics and organizing, and second, that they will then choose to move to another places where it's much easier with these kind of professions to move. I don't have the data about like how many physicians actually left the country to work in other places. I guess there are, but it doesn't seem like a very prominent trend. And I think this is related also to ideas of sumud of Palestinians. And even if someone is acting totally unpolitically, just trying to be a successful doctor and close their mouth shut and just not getting into any politics or any kind of organization, it's still for many Palestinians considered part of the resistance, part of the Sumud, to stay in Palestine and to work, to grow kids in Palestine, to succeed in whatever career they choose. So I'm not sure all the Palestinian physicians that don't leave the country have this idea in mind, but of course social relations and very cohesive families and communities are also part of that. But I think from what I know, most of the physicians in the country stay and doesn't leave for life. I mean, they go to fellowships and come back, like someone I know.
Thank you, Guy. Ella, do you want to respond to some of Amalia's points or add anything?
Yeah, I just want to thank for any comments because I really sounded late, so I really appreciate that. No, I agree with you that I have to work on the civil society thing. I guess in my head, I'm always writing not so much for anthropologists, but those from political science, because I feel in anthropology, there's like, we mostly agree and it's our bubble and it's safe and nice. So when I think about those notions of conspiracy theories, like the issue that it has to be registered or something, that's me in my head speaking to people who think, like who are not in this anthropological field. But no, I agree with you. It's like a very first draft, so things have to be refined. And I like the Trojan horse metaphor. I like it. Thank you. I might steal it once it becomes published. But I actually had a question for Guy, because in the English-speaking world, there was a lot of this. There was this slogan of "We are all in this together," and I wonder if it was at all appropriated in Israel. If so, how? And also, I found both papers very interesting, and I've learned a lot. But I also thought that what you are speaking about in Israel. It resembled a little bit of what was going on at the same time in UK due to Brexit, where the migrants were put forward and it was seen as an opportunity to show migrants are not demons who are stealing our benefits. Without them, we would die. And Boris Johnson is in the hospital, taken care of by the foreign nurses. And there was also this attempt to use that moment. I think it was equally unsuccessful, but anyway, I thought that if it might be something interesting as a point of comparison, if you're going to write it out, then for referencing or something. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Hannah, I have a comment / question for Hannah. I think I'm pretty sure, but Katerina, correct me if I'm wrong, that Hannah's is the only paper in our conference that related to gender directly, which I thought was really interesting and also specifically important that in Hannah's paper was about sort of how certain gender divisions or power structures, COVID and the lockdowns made them, transferable from different spaces that they were maybe more ritualized into other spaces in which they were not. I think I told Hannah before that in one of the lockdowns, I walked around in the neighborhood with my daughter and she saw one of the minyans outside. And then my daughter asked me, and she was 6, she asked, how come there are only men standing there? So it's that perspective of exactly like the anthropological child, looking at what we take for granted. So thank you, Hannah, for adding that perspective. But if you have anything to add to Amalia's comments.
So first of all, sorry for the noise here. First of all, Omri, I might have to give you guys pseudonyms and include that scene because it's wonderful. And having like the perspective of a child, I think is really powerful. Like the honesty. And like, yeah, I do remember you mentioning this and now I want to include it. And to Amalia, I just took a whole bunch of notes while you were speaking and I really appreciate your reading. And one thing specifically that I I don't think I thought about enough that you spoke about more generally, not specifically with regards to my own paper, but the vulnerability and the emotional terms of the pandemic is something that I don't think I really took seriously in the writing of this paper. And it's something that I really want to think with, like, what does it mean when, like, the vulnerability, and how is that affecting these people's actions? As much as it's causing exclusion, it's also coming from like, there also people are also like have their own iterations of themselves feeling excluded from their own spaces, and that kind of like emotional attention, I think, is really, really important. So thank you for pointing that out. And about the eruv, several other people have also mentioned that, and it's totally key. And I definitely am going to be writing that into the paper. The comparison is very productive. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that as well.
I think that generally what you all of you described in during COVID is we have to see how it relates to the late modern condition. It's all being processed through the notions that preoccupy people nowadays, which are, yes, heightened emotional language, self-doubt, reflexivity. I mean, in Guy's case, that's quite obvious. All the touchy-feeliness in the how when has the political discourse in Israel turned so touchy-feely? It's not Israeli at all. It's a very interesting global influence. Of course, the attempt to depoliticize what is glaringly political. Yeah.
I can say to Ella, thanks for your comment. As an anthropologist, I was always very, very suspicious of any kind of global comparisons. I really couldn't see how people are doing that. But again, against a pandemic, a global pandemic makes you really see these connections much clearer. And I'm actually in touch with a researcher in the UK, and we are trying to do this very same comparison that you were talking about, because I think in the UK the discourse was very similar in many ways, of course in a very different context, but still in a colonial, post-colonial, still colonial context. So it had a lot of connections. Thanks.
I see Anthony made a really smart comment in the chat, which is interesting because I think Ella, when Anthony presented, had an interesting comment. So it's an interesting dialogue in the sense of the two sessions. Anthony, do you want to, I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. If you want to share, we have some time. So if you want to share it.
Yeah, you bet. I think this is one of the great things about interdisciplinary conferences and workshops like you guys have there, just kind of picking out different ideas. But I think, I'm rattling my head here, but I think sociologists were definitely ahead of political scientists when thinking in terms of these voluntary associations could actually have, kind of a bad act on society. I mean, voluntary associations are great because they're filled with people who have similar values, and we have these kind of shared interests. So we can easily start to trust each other when we start to say, go here and here for this types of service or this type of good. So those associations can be vectors for spreading information, but also misinformation, which is something that I think we saw during the pandemic. In the United States, where I'm at here in Atlanta, I mean, everything that surrounded the election was primarily driven through these kind of voluntary associations, and they become these kind of echo chambers. And then when we think about just these different types of groups, I mean, there are some that are just, they're fun, when we think about recreational leagues and stuff like that. Some are silly when we think about the Flat Earth Society or groups that go out and look for Bigfoot every weekend, or UFO spotters. Like, those are silly but relatively harmless. But then we also have these, flat out bad ones that really propagate just hateful attitudes, and they kind of provide this kind of insulation for intolerance that can perpetuate over time and generations. So yeah, I think it's super messy. So just to say that civil society is good and civil society organizations are all good, or as I think I talked about it on Monday, like angels from heaven, I think that's wrong. I even think there's an opportunity for people to profit from them when we think about briefcase NGOs. And I think that's one of the benefits of having, you know, sound regulation and stuff in these in different countries is to kind of protect usurpers from taking advantage of the legal form for private profit. So yeah, I think it's great, but I also think it's super scary. Like, how the heck are you gonna, like, you know, call balls and strikes on that, right? Just because you have a particular attitude towards something, I don't want the government saying, like, necessarily saying like that group shouldn't exist, because that could easily spiral out of control. But yet you don't want people going around saying that COVID's fake, right? I think that's super tricky. And I don't know. Yeah, I'm not an elected official, so I'm not going to claim to know the answer on that one. So, but it's interesting.
Thank you, Anthony. I think this is a good point to end our session and almost bring our conference to a close. So yeah, we had 3 days spread out within this last week. Thank you so much to Deborah and Eli, and to Michal and to Ido Rosenzweig, who made it all possible. It's really great to be in Minerva and have this support and try to do different interdisciplinary projects. Thanks to all the participants in the panel, to Guy, to Hannah, and to Ella and to Amalia for the excellent comments. And now to my colleague Katharina, who will almost bring the conference to a close.
Great, Omri, thanks for this big round of thank you. I also want to say thanks for all the support, also especially of Michal behind the scenes, and Omri, to you, to putting this together. It was really a pleasure to work on an interdisciplinary level, on an interdisciplinary conference.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
And Anthony, you summed it up very nicely. It's always very interesting to hear different perspectives, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists. So we're very happy to have someone who is kind of really chosen to do the job of the closing comments, Professor Eli Salzberger, because he was the former head of the Haifa Center for German European Studies, where I'm located, and he's the current head of the Minerva Center, where Omri is related. So, and he is a lawyer, so maybe we get a little bit of a legal perspective, right? So Eli, I will hand over to you, and looking forward to close this very beautiful 3 workshop days.
Thank you very much, Katharina. I will not give a paper from a legal perspective. I will not keep you very much long, but it's really a pleasure and an honor to conclude this so rich workshop, 4 panels, and we heard from practitioners, from actual members of different organizations from Israel and from outside Israel. We heard from political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, not lawyers this time. We had papers on the macro level and on a very micro level of various examples from different countries, from democratic countries and non-democratic countries. So all this in 4 sessions is almost unbelievable. The conference was focused on the relations between NGO and civil society organization and the state in time of COVID. And it raised in this session, but also in previous sessions, I think, 3 interesting pillars. One is civil society. What is our understanding of civil society? This session really dealt with the issue. Civil society is a new terminology from the 80s, but civil society was very important force also before that. And when we talk about civil society and democracy, or civil society progressive only for progressive causes, we have to remember that the Nazis regime was assisted very much by civil society organizations. So civil society can go from various directions. It's not only progressive and democratic, pro-democratic organization. But it's interesting to think about civil society. Sociologists make this distinction between, or definition as a civil society as a 3rd sector, as opposed to business and government. And we had here some interesting remarks about this distinction, and even extending the frontiers of civil society to consulting organizations, which are part of the business world. So this is an interesting border or vagueness that is calling for further research and consideration. From political theory, the role of civil society as a fourth branch of government. What is the role of civil society organization as opposed to our elected officials is a very interesting question. It was also touched about here in our conference, as well as the question whether civil society is all grassroots and volunteers, or people who are, in many cases, many NGOs are actually employees and basically play on the business sector and maybe efficiency. Hillel Schmidt talked about it. NGOs are not efficient. Are they meant to be efficient? Are they meant to be part of the business sector or the government? Interesting question. And we heard about civil society in autocracies versus democracies. We have to remember that only 3% of the world population lives under a regime that does not restrict at all civil society organization. This is really a very marginal percentage of the world population. And the role civil society plays in autocracies and democracies is a very interesting question as well. In many autocracies, civil society organizations try to democratize. And in some of these autocracies, actually governments depend financially on civil society organization, while in other countries, civil society organizations are dependent on government and government financial assistance. So this is a very interesting contrast that also can be expanded. And the question, the legal question that I can really address, but I will not address here, is, how to regulate by law civil society. We had a big conference on the Israeli NGO law a few years ago. But when we hear here that civil society also comprises of organizations that promote very, very right-wing, false conspiracy theories, fake news, there is an interesting room for debate about how to regulate civil society. So this was one leg of the conference topic. The second leg was the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, which we are still in early recovery phase from. And we have to remember that this was probably the biggest global crisis in 100 years in terms of how it affected individual life of people everywhere. In this sense, it is a crisis much more severe than a war, even a world war, because the restrictions that were imposed to fight the pandemic on our personal freedoms, or our, freedom of movement, freedom to associate, religious freedom, are unprecedented. And this is a very interesting question of how governments dealt with COVID-19, the reaction of COVID-19. We heard here some papers that looked on this macro level. More than 100 governments in the world declared a state of emergency, which means that the regular political process or the regular legislative process is replaced by executive-led process, much less democratic process. And the question is whether countries operated within the rule of law, outside the rule of law, within all the formal facets of the rule of law. And this is a topic that will continue to engage a lot of interest in writing in the next few years. And then we arrive to the relations between NGO and the state in times of COVID. And I think that two main interesting questions were asked and addressed in this conference. One was about whether governments exploited the emergency power, or the powers, or the rhetoric of fighting against the pandemic in order to infringe individual rights, human freedoms, but also limit NGO more than before. I think the Israeli case doesn't support this, but we heard some other cases from other places in the world in which the government used the emergency powers and the extreme conditions in order to curtail further civil society organization. And the second important question is how NGOs were incorporated into this collective fight against the pandemic. And here we heard very interesting stories from civil society organizations, some of which really reinvented themselves. And we heard various models. In some countries, government actually contracted civil societies as subcontractor to perform the policies of the government. In other countries, we heard the example of the German application app, that there was a cooperation between civil society organization and the government. And I think again, from a legal perspective, this is something that has to be actually anchored. You know, we are thinking now, we are drafting a draft emergency law in Israel, which is lacking such comprehensive legislation, unlike many other countries. And I think that in such a law, the role of representatives of civil society or NGOs in the decision-making process in time of emergency will be crucial. So you have to incorporate civil society even by a legislative framework, and then brings up the question of the role and the conceptualization of civil society and whether it has to be outside the realm of government and so forth and so on. So I think that, you know, the range of issues that we dealt with were really fascinating and very broad. And I think that it was a workshop and not a conference. And I think the interesting difference between a workshop and a conference, that the workshop is a process. Most of the papers were papers in draft. And it will be very important to continue the dialogue among the participants, which might even yield a publication. I'm sure that Omri, Katerina are thinking about this. So this was really great. I want to thank Omri, Katerina, Deborah, Michal, Ido for this very successful workshop. And see you next time in person, in physical Haifa, beautiful Haifa, and not over the Zoom. Thanks and good evening, everyone.